Hello, I'm Rob Price. This season, we're exploring agentic AI from the perspectives of those driving its evolution. Welcome to Futurise.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Wade. I'm a professor at the IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland, and I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Michael, it's great to have you back on the podcast, although it was a different podcast when we were talking before. Um, but today we're going to talk about AI and agentic AI especially. And
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of posts from you over, well, and heard you talk on your podcast as well about this topic, both in the context of generative AI and agentic. So I guess my first question is what are you seeing? Where are we on this mad acceleration of new technology in this space?
I think it is a mad acceleration. About a year ago, a co-author and I were putting our final touches on a book on AI. So, a year ago or less than a year ago, and I remember, having a conversation at that time saying, maybe we should put something in there about agents. It seems to be something that people are just starting to talk about. So we put in half a chapter on agentic AI. That was less than a year ago. And now suddenly it's become de rigueur. Like everybody's talking about how agents are going to change everything. But there is, I think, a lot of confusion still around what is an agent, what's the difference between agentic AI and generative AI. So I'd say to answer your question, where are we? We're probably still in the experimental stage, in some cases in the early operational phase. I think a lot of organizations are running demos at the moment, but I've seen relatively few agentic systems actually doing mission critical work end to end or operating at scale.
I mean, in a sense, I'm just reminded of our work on digital responsibility. For me, that was kind of very much driven by the pace of change of technology is too great. We can't all keep up, and of course that's even more so kind of now in terms of what we're seeing. But you spend your days, weeks talking to execs across well Europe and the world through the work that you're doing. So how on earth are they finding their pathway around that market and the ecosystem out there? How are they making decisions in terms of running their businesses?
Well, I think there's a very interesting tension at the moment between FOMO, the fear of missing out. Everybody's talking about how these agents are going to change everything and the promise of increased productivity, efficiency, reducing costs. But then there's also FOMO, fear of messing up. So on the one hand, there's a fear of missing out. On the other hand, there's a fear of messing up. They're nervous about this. Giving responsibility to agents, taking humans out of the loop, which is a necessary phase with agentic AI rollouts. And so they're kind of stuck between these two extremes, FOMO and FOMO. And so I think they're at the pilot stage, but very nervous about going beyond the pilots at the moment.
It's interesting. You're the second person who's used that phrase within the last couple of weeks. And indeed, I was at a big conference recently where it was expressed quite similarly at the start by the keynote. It was very much, will you be looking back in 3 years thinking, oh, if only I'd kind of taken a step earlier in, or would you be looking at kind of thinking, oh my word, I'm glad that I did because I've seen this ability to kind of make sense of this and drive growth. It's probably not as simple as those two options, but is there anything surprising that you're picking up, whether it's from the market in terms of what people are saying? I mean, it feels a bit like the days of cloud for me. Everything's
Yeah,
cloud, everything's
yeah,
agentic, no matter what it is. Or indeed
yeah.
what people are observing through those demos or pilots that they're creating.
Well, as I said, there's lots of things going on. There's a lot of ambition. You have the people who are talking about how it's going to change everything, and then you have the people actually doing it who are worried. With legitimately worried about control and reliability. What happens when an agent goes wrong, right? But it looks confident. So really making sure they understand the difference between confidence and competence, because they'd be confident, but it's not necessarily competent. Issues with security and IP, issues with regulation and potential liabilities. We've seen examples of agents going rogue, what that looks like. And then, of course, there's the kind of the bigger, more existential questions around the impact of the change on jobs, skills, culture, in organizations. So all of that is kind of playing out. But I'd say the thing to answer your question about what's surprising is that I think a lot of executives are worrying. They have a concern about organizational dependence on agents. So what happens, when agents, really take up a very important strategic part of the workflows? And what does that mean for skills? So that, are we going to forget how to operate without agents? So it's kind of the opposite of the usual robots will take our jobs discussion. Bit reverse, what if we gradually de-skill critical operations and then technology fails or regulations change or vendors raise prices? Where are we then without the human depth that we used to have before these agents, took over all these responsibilities and workflows? So it's surprising to me how much organizations are thinking through, the questions of how do we automate without hollowing out our own expertise, right? How do we preserve institutional memory and judgment in a world where agents are doing more of the kind of the heavy lifting? So that's sort of an interesting debate that organizations are having. They're already thinking through the long-term implications of outsourcing a lot of the cognitive work to agents.
I'm slightly conflicted on that in the sense that I remember 20 years ago, I was working in airports and they'd just introduced self-service check-in. And it was, well, what happens if they fail? How we haven't got the volume of people to process people through the airport. So in part, I guess my head is asking, is that just not the continuation of technology automation that we've seen for decades before? On the other hand, what I'm also picking up is I almost a real fear about the depth of knowledge leaving the workforce. So deep experts with decades of experience in doing their thing, and then organizations really struggling to recruit that because partly people don't want to stay for decades. And the skills just aren't there in the market. So that's almost crying out demand for, is there a technological solution to help that sustainability? D- d- but those are slightly in conflict because in one hand I'm saying it's just the same, and in the other hand I'm saying, but hey, maybe we need that solution now.
So I think there's a lot of this ambiguity at the moment, right? We just don't know. I suspect that there is going to be a shift in sort of the capabilities that organizations need away from deep, deep, deep experts, because an agent or some other automation tool can have huge, massive depth on a particular topic. The so-called I people, right, with very, very deep I-shaped knowledge. Used to be the heroes in organizations because they knew more than anyone else. But as challenges shift, those people may become less useful because that area of knowledge where they have amazing depth is no longer the one that's needed. But so we're moving into a world where it's more T people, people who have some depth, but they can also have breadth. Or even now we're talking about M people, right? That have multiple different areas of experience, but maybe not at huge depth, but they can shift as the needs in the organization shift. So this is, argues for, constant workforce capability building, training, going back to school, making sure you have relevant skills across different areas to be able to manage, this agentic workforce that's actually doing a lot of the really deep, deep knowledge. But these things are all just emerging, and we're still, I think, challenged with that ambiguity that you brought up. How is that going to work? We just don't know.
So I'm really keen to explore that in a bit more detail and actually also touch on your radar diagrams and clocks. But before we do, there's just one thing that I'm intrigued about that you mentioned earlier, touched on. So for those listening, you've got a bookshelf behind you or several bookshelves full of your books. You write about digital transformation and all the things that we're talking about here. But in this pace of change, it must be really difficult as an author because by the time it takes you to produce a book, it's almost out of date. How are you
Absolutely.
thinking about that challenge at the moment? This is very much with your author hat on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue that the age of books has kind of passed passed by. But for me, there's two benefits of books. One is to force me to go into the level of depth, right, that you need to write a book. And because we tend to sort of bounce along the surface these days, things are changing so quickly that as a topic, then there's another topic. We never get into that depth. And I think going into depth on a topic is really useful. So I think for me it's a therapeutic process to write a book and force myself to get into depth in the topic. But I think there's something else too. Uh, when you look at books like this, I don't tend to write books that are factual because the facts change. But I think if you can identify themes that are kind of evergreen themes that span different, ages and challenges that are relevant across a longer period of time, I like to build my books around those themes that it doesn't really matter if we're talking about Gen AI or agentic AI or whatever comes next, world AI or robotic AI. These themes, these frameworks and tools are still valid because they go beyond just the technology. And so that's what I try to build my books around. But for sure, they have to, the Gain book that I released earlier this year on generative AI, we're already planning a Gain More book, right? Which is an update.
I think that's a really important point because I think from a personal point of view, one of the things I've found hugely valuable, learning, evolving, understanding what's happening over the last 2.5 years, is because we're building them too. So it's that because we're going deeper. It's not just a thought leadership exercise. It's informed by the practicality of delivering these things, building them, finding a way to make them work, finding a way to kind of make them operational. So it's that learned experience, that the common, whether you're writing a book, whether you're delivering an agent, whether you're working with execs kind of across businesses, that learned experience, that going deeper, I think that's such an important point. So one of the things that I've done regularly over the last 2.5 years is look at your radar diagrams because it's always phenomenally useful to actually have a view about what's out there in the market. Tell us a bit more about well the idea for that and how you've kept them up to date.
Yeah, I mean, we get the question a lot, what are the tools that you recommend? And of course, we have the big frontier models that everybody's heard about, the ChatGPTs and the Geminis and the Claudes and the Groks and the DeepSeeks and all of that. And they're kind of jacks or jills of all trades. They can do a lot of things, at a reasonable skill level. But if you have a specific need or use case, there's often a tool that is designed for that does a better job than the frontier models. So we've started producing these maps that link, specific use cases or benefits that you would want in an organizational setting, because we focus on the needs of organizations and businesses, to specific tools. And we started more recently looking at industry specific, so sector specific maps, looking at and the tools, and they do constantly change. So we have to update these things multiple times a year because the tools, some of them get better, some of them drop away. They get acquired and what have you. So keeping track of all these tools is a full-time job. Now they are consolidating. They will continue to consolidate, but at the moment it's a very fragmented picture. So I do feel bad for organizations like, which AI tools should I adopt? Okay, so we have Copilot, but Copilot is useful for some summarize documents and all great, but for something in the legal department or the purchasing department or engineering or sales or whatever, they have specific needs beyond what Copilot or something like that can provide. So what are those tools? So we provide these maps to try and help organizations to kind of make sense of the fragmented landscape out there.
One of the things that I've heard a lot expressed on LinkedIn and others is SaaS is dead. So agents will do everything. Now, do you see in those tools that you're finding where they operate within defined verticals or areas of the operating model, a tool that does invoicing, a tool that does whatever the thing it does? Is there a risk that they become threatened by the ability of agents to be greater, more extensible, to be able to kind of I guess it's the interoperability of applications that I'm talking about. How would organizations plug these niche applications together, whether they're AI, agentic, SaaS,
Yeah.
versus this kind of agentic mesh theory that we've talked about on some of the previous discussions in podcasts. Is that an area that you've kind of got a view on?
Well, let's see how this plays out. I think we need to differentiate between applications and data. I think the need and the benefit of harmonizing, standardizing data is ever present. Because if you have multiple different data formats, it is challenging. You always lose when you try to kind of stitch these things together. So I think there continues to be and there will continue to be a benefit for harmonizing and standardizing data. Now, when it comes to applications, there's also benefits there, but I think one of the promise of agents and new protocols like MCP from Anthropic or A to A from Google to kind of manage agents that can go in kind of across application landscapes and interact with each other to get things done, I think reduces somewhat the need to standardize applications. So I think because it's always painful, but agents can reduce the pain somewhat of having to standardize and harmonize applications. But I still think there's a big benefit to harmonizing the underlying data.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, in essence, I think we'd probably both have a view that said you can imagine a dynamic network of agents, but it has yet to be proven as an efficient model before we could possibly kind of say, well, this is no longer required or that is. Um, Now, I kind of last saw the IMD AI risk clock at about
Yeah.
20 minutes to midnight-ish, kind of there or
Yes.
thereabouts. Um,
Yes.
talk to me a bit about that and kind of what you're seeing as the things that alter the time either way.
Yeah, so this is something we released a little more than a year ago because there's so much confusion, I think, and so many opinions about the risk factor of AI, but very little quantitative analysis. So we took a very much a data-driven view. We look at three different components. We look at the sophistication of the tools, so the algorithms, the chips that underlie them, and all of that that get better over time. We look at the autonomy of these models with the thinking that the more autonomous they are, the higher the risk factor, because if we control them, that's okay. But if they can suddenly they're autonomous, then that we have less control. And the third thing we look at is the link between these tools and the outside world. If they're just operating in a room somewhere, not connected to anything, big deal. But if they're connected to social systems, financial systems, infrastructure, weapons, that has a much bigger risk, brings with it a much bigger risk factor. So I think and we have moved the clock. And by the way, for us, midnight, so it goes from 11 p.m. to midnight, just like the AI doomsday clock. And midnight is uncontrolled AGI. So AI that's as smart as humans, that's out of our control. So the rise of agentic systems actually is highly relevant to this because it impacts the second factor that I mentioned, which is autonomy. And agents are designed to be autonomous, right? We give them tasks and they go off and they do those tasks. And the more autonomous they become, the higher the risk factor is that we take humans out of the loop. So that's one of the reasons that the clock has moved 9 minutes. There's 60 minutes in total, right? It's moved 9 minutes in about 14 months. Is the rise of agentic systems and the fact that they're becoming more and more autonomous. I mean, for the moment, 20 minutes to midnight means we still have time. But it also means we have to start thinking seriously about protecting the downside. It's not about stopping innovation. It's about acknowledging the fact that we are developing tools and systems faster than our ability to control them. So putting in safeguards and checks and balances, particularly when it comes to agents, just to ensure that they are acting in the interests of humanity and not against that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that the regulators in many of the main countries that are developing these systems and rolling them out have that same point of view.
I think there's two challenges, both in terms of the point of view, which we know is always kind of informed by political position, and then equally just their ability to keep up with that pace, even if there was the desire and the intent. How do you actually create enforceable regulations that can impact in an efficient time? How, out of interest, as you're doing that risk analysis, how do you
Mhm.
differentiate between claims or intent versus reality? Because I guess there'll be plenty of things that you hear in conversations or read, but then the question is, yeah, but how true is that?
So there's a lot of stuff going out there, and we scrape hundreds of news items every week that goes into our analysis. We look at all the benchmarks, which are relatively quantitative. We scan dozens of pieces of legislation that get enacted every month. So we try to take a evidence-based point of view, kind of separating the outlandish claims from the validated facts. It's not always easy to do, and ultimately, when we come up with a particular number, which is the position of the clock, there's a little bit of human judgment that goes along with that. But we try as much as we can to make it fact based and evidence based. We accept that people may disagree on our final analysis, but we don't want people to criticize us on our facts. So the analysis of the facts, people can have a point of view on, but we really try to make a fact-based point of view and separate. There's so many claims, so many opinions out there, Rob. Everybody has an opinion, but very few of those opinions are truly fact-based today.
Yeah. So one of the things for those listening to the conversation, we should probably say that you and I have both written extensively about and talked about and collaborated around digital responsibility over many years, kind of what
Yes.
people should or shouldn't do.
Yes.
And therefore, we're both obviously going to kind of focus on risks and positive impact because that's in our nature and our body of work behind us. But if we
Yeah.
can think about the positive impact around innovation, so how can we what's the greatest value that agentic AI can deliver organizations or deliver society? What are the things that you're hearing or seeing that give you um, that well excite you in terms of the positive things that could be gained from this technology evolution or revolution?
So I'm glad you asked this question, Rob, because when we're talking about sort of existential impact, the conversations often steer towards the negative, right? Because that existential threat is there. But the positive impacts are huge. They really are. And from an organizational point of view, a lot of the focus today is on efficiency and productivity, and clearly the benefits are there. But there's other benefits, and so other categories of benefits I think are in quality. So not only improving the productivity of something, doing more stuff in the same amount of time, but also increasing the quality of that stuff. And then I think the third category, the third area is on creativity. I mean, we've had AI tools for many, many decades, and they've been helping us with productivity and quality, but they haven't really had an impact on innovation or creativity. And I think generative AI and by extension agentic AI, which are all based on the same underlying technologies, have this ability to be creative and innovative, and that excites me the most. I mean, I have great confidence that this technology will solve some of our biggest challenges, around environmental impact. You and I have talked about and written about this over the years. The impact on the environment is significant. And I believe that today, the net impact of AI on the environment is negative, but it has a huge potential to be positive in solving some of these problems. Another area is the medical field. Um, I'm very confident that this technology will solve some of our major medical challenges with its combination of brute force, computational power, and creativity. For example, I expect in the next 2, 3 years that many of us will have digital twins based on our genomes that'll allow medical professionals with the support of AI to provide really customized, personalized treatment plans for us. Well, treatment assumes that we have something wrong with us, but it's more than that, anticipating what could happen to us in the future and proactively helping us to avoid, anything that might harm us. So I think it's going to have huge impacts on our health, our longevity, our quality of life, beyond over and beyond the organizational productivity benefits. So I'm an optimist, Rob, as you know, and I do think even though we have to accept that the existential threat is there and we have to protect against that, most of the impacts of this technology are going to be positive.
And I think that's just such an important point. It does enable that discovery, that resolution, that moving us forward and solving some of the things that frankly are there as kind of big challenges anyway, irrespective of anything that we've seen over the last kind of 2, 3 years. And I do think that that gets lost in a lot of the conversations. Um, so in terms of, let's go back to the organisations and the executives that you meet on a regular basis.
Yeah.
If you were to encapsulate all of this conversation and all of the work that you've been doing, what are the kind of tips that you would give them? What direction would you point them in terms of, I guess, trying to do something in this agentic space rather than sitting and watching?
Yeah, I think the temptation is to try and do too many things. I'd recommend being pretty focused, have some focused use cases based on real, painful challenges, whether it's a customer, it could be external, it could be linked with a sort of customer problem. It also could be an internal pain point. Sometimes internal is better because it's less risky. Don't try and do too many things. Start with a clear challenge that you're facing. Put together, a kind of an agentic AI strike team to focus on those 2 or 3 things. It's not 10 to 15, it's 2 or 3, and really try and work through the end-to-end workflows. So the technology part, but making sure that the processes, the governance, is right. So try to solve those problems, get a benefit early. You'll build legitimacy, credibility from that, and then roll that out. So that means focus. It means prioritization, and prioritization more than anything else is not about saying yes to things. It's saying no to things. So avoid and resist the temptation to try and do too many things. Start with something simple that's obvious. This is a pain point. This is something we're spending way too much time on. We're making too many mistakes. We're spending too much money, and then show the benefits. through these kind of agentic solutions. Start simple, but really think through not just the technology, but those strike teams. I think they need to have technologists on there, but probably need to have also, people who understand the workflows, compliance, these maybe even a representative from customers or whatever, making sure it's a multidisciplinary team that can really think through the wider implications of what these agents are doing and try to get those wins, right? And think in terms of 3 to 6 months, not 12 to 18 months. Too long. It's just too long. And if you can get those clear benefits, that will build the credibility for, wider organizational rollouts.
No, that's great advice. Um, right, so I think this is going to be the last, well, it is the last episode in season two, looking at agentic AI of Futurise. We will be back in season three for more agentic conversations. But I guess as the final word, Michael, what are you most excited about as a continuation of this innovation in 2026?
So we have, the Gen AI wave that is washed over us. There's the agentic AI wave, which is starting to wash over us, right? And I think the next wave, which is building, out there, but within view, is the sort of the robotic AI wave, where we're taking the intelligence of generative AI, the autonomy of agentic AI, and put it in the sort of the physical form, whether it's, it could be a robot, but it doesn't have to be. It could be in a manufacturing facility. It could be a vehicle, but basically putting the intelligence and the autonomy of these systems in something that's physical could have a massive, massive transformative impact on logistics, manufacturing, supply chains. And I think that's where we're going because most robots today are not very intelligent. They're not very autonomous. And the potential to improve productivity and quality, safety is really, really, I think huge and exciting. So, I think 2026 is the year where we're taking this away from just the software layer and bringing it into the hardware.